Okay, good morning, everyone. I think we'll get started. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Annika Smith, and I'm an associate professor at Windsor Law and also the director of the Windsor Law Center for Cities. On behalf of Windsor Law and the Center for Cities, welcome to all of you. I acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi people. And I acknowledge with gratitude the work that is ongoing in our community and elsewhere towards implementing the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and working towards reconciliation in our community and elsewhere. Thanks to our candidates and to our moderator for joining us this morning in particular. Before I turn the floor to one of our Center for Cities student research associates to say a word about the center and to introduce our moderator for today, let me just say a special word of welcome to any youth and in particular any first-time voters who are joining us live today or listening to the recording afterwards. A big thank you as well to Rose City Politics, who will be making today and tomorrow's recordings available as a podcast, and I should say yesterday's and today's, recordings available as a podcast and live video recording. That's already up from yesterday from Windsor West. And also thanks to our Windsor Law Communications Director, Rochelle Prince, for all of her support. And finally to the campaign teams working very hard to fit this in, along with many other pressing events in a full campaign in a short space of time. We appreciate your collaboration very much. I just want to note as well before turning the floor that we did also invite, in addition to our NDP and Liberal candidates joining us today, the Conservative and Green Party candidates for Windsor-Tecumseh, following the selections being made at the national level by CBC and Rancho Canada. They sent regrets based on other obligations for today. Thanks again. I'll turn the floor now to Gush Maness to introduce our moderator for today.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Gush Minhas, and I'm a second-year law student at Windsor Law and a student research associate at the Windsor Law Center for Cities. The Windsor Law Center for Cities at the University of Windsor was established in 2019 as a venue for supporting research, teaching, and community engagement on the legal and policy tools of inclusive and sustainable cities. You can learn more about our work, including other upcoming public events, on our website at www.windsorlawcities.ca. We are proud to host today's Windsor-Tecumseh Candidates Forum on the Vision for Cities. With that being said, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for our event, Rich Garton. Rich Garton is known to many of you as a reporter with CTV Windsor, a position he's held since 2009. During his time with CTV Windsor, Rich has often covered municipal affairs in the city. And as a native of Oakville, Ontario, he holds 2 degrees from the University of Windsor and currently lives in Windsor with his wife and 2 children. So welcome, Rich, and I'll turn the floor over to you to introduce our candidates and explain the format of today's forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gush, and good afternoon to everyone watching. Thank you for once again having me as your moderator for today's debate. Let's start with a quick introduction of our participating candidates. Eric Kuzmierczak is a former city councillor for Windsor and the incumbent member of parliament for Windsor-Tecumseh. He is the Liberal Party of Canada candidate for Windsor-Tecumseh in this 2021 federal election. Cheryl Hardcastle is also a former town councillor and deputy mayor for Tecumseh and previous member of parliament for Windsor-Tecumseh. Cheryl is representing the NDP in Windsor-Tecumseh in the 2021 federal election. Now that we know who's taking part, a quick rundown of the format for today's debate. The first round will feature 4 questions for candidates drafted by the Center for Cities team. Each candidate will be given the opportunity to respond first to 2 of these questions, the order randomly selected through a coin toss we did just before we started. The first speaker will have 2 minutes, and the other candidate will be given 1 minute to respond. The first candidate may be given 30 seconds to rebut at my discretion, but I do encourage it. Please respect these time allocations so we can have as much discourse as possible. After that, we will take questions from you, the audience. You are invited to use the Q&A function to submit questions. Please keep in mind that questions should relate to the topic of this forum, which is the priorities of the City of Windsor and Tecumseh and federal issues with a municipal impact. Questions will be selected according to their relevance, the extent to which they ask something the candidates have not already been asked. We anticipate having 15 to 20 minutes for audience questions. Candidates will alternate in the order they're asked to respond to the question unless it is directed at a specific candidate. Each candidate will have 1 minute to respond to the audience question with rebuttal again at my discretion. Following these rounds of questions, the candidates will each be given 2 minutes to give a closing statement. The candidate who lost the initial coin toss to begin the debate will have the opportunity to speak first. In addition to a live audience today, as Annika mentioned, this forum is being recorded and will be available on the Windsor Law Center for Cities website later today. It will also be made available as a podcast by our friends at Rose City Politics. So before we begin, I want to thank everyone for their patience. We held the Windsor West debate yesterday, and we can only hope this goes just as smoothly. But thank you for your understanding. If there are hiccups along the way, it will likely be my fault. Candidates are encouraged to leave their screen view on gallery so that they can see me at all times, as I will give visual cues, something like this, when your time is almost up. And I'll keep doing that until you stop. And we reserve the right to mute your microphones if those time limits are not being respected. All right, thank you everyone, and let's get started. So we did the coin toss, and Cheryl called heads, and Cheryl was correct. So she will take the first question, and this one will be about economic transformation of the region. So Cheryl, the Windsor-Essex economy, which is often focused largely around the automotive industry, is in the process of a transformation. Diversification has always been a challenge locally, and much of the federal funding that has flowed to Windsor for economic development in the last couple of years has focused on that auto sector. While federal funding for autonomous and electric vehicle production and expertise will support this, there are many facets of our community not touched by these initiatives. Some of these sectors, Main Street businesses and entrepreneurs, and the arts, for example, are the ones who could make our economy more livable for residents and attractive to the talent that we seek to attract. How would your government ensure that economic development funding flowing to Windsor-Essex supports a range of sectors and a collective vision of transformation to a vibrant and green economy that all residents can get behind? Cheryl, you have 2 minutes.
Thanks very much. I'm really pleased to be here and have these kinds of discussions. I think that question brings us to what I would envision as a larger web. And I don't know if you've ever watched a spider make a web, but they work from the outside with targets and work their way to a middle focus. So I think that is the job of a federal government to facilitate with municipalities, with small business entrepreneurs, working with those kinds of partners for targeting the kind of diversity that they recognize that they need in each municipality. So the first thing I will say, because I know we're going to talk about climate, we're going to talk about climate adaptation, not to be confused with addressing the climate crisis and getting to zero emissions, but those opportunities are everywhere. And we need to use that lens, that environmental lens, on all of the projects that we have. So even when it comes to something like arts, if you are concentrating on cultural building after a pandemic for live arts, you want to make sure that any opportunity to include funding for building the kind of infrastructure, the stages, the types of equipment that they need, that it's not just about local procurement, but it is about that kind of efficiency for climate. I will say the same about housing. Affordable housing is something I'm sure is going to come up. It's on everyone's minds. I see a lot of new builds actually in Windsor, and I see opportunities where we could be incentivizing living roofs on these projects. We could be incentivizing some of the innovations that just need a successful project to be able to set a precedent and set a tone for more of that same kind of innovation. And that entrepreneurial spirit is also a part of it. And we need to find ways to navigate and talk and help those small entrepreneurs tap into that kind of funding.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. Eric, you have 1 minute to respond.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. And you know, economic development requires a holistic, all of government approach. But I want to zero in on one specific item, and that's, you know, Cheryl mentioned climate change, and absolutely it is an existential threat to Canada and the world. But at the same time, it also presents a remarkable opportunity for this community. You know, our government has made a $100 billion investment to fighting climate change and also to the green recovery. And that includes, for example, establishing an $8 billion net zero accelerator fund. that's going to allow us to work with companies like Stellantis, formerly Fiat Chrysler, to attract electric vehicle manufacturing and battery manufacturing to a community like ours. Rich, this is transformational for our community. This is thousands of jobs that would be created and that would really secure the prosperity of our region for the future. But we also need to focus not just in bringing electric vehicle manufacturing here and battery electric vehicle manufacturing here, but we also need to support the arts and culture sector. We also need to make investments in entrepreneurs through, for example, the Women Entrepreneurship Strategy and also the Black Entrepreneurship Fund. And we also need to make investments in broadband. Our Universal Broadband Fund is making sure that all Canadians will be connected to the internet, because we know that high-speed internet is so critical to economic development across all of our communities and across all sectors.
Thank you, Eric. And Cheryl, you've indicated you'd like to respond.
Yeah, I just want to add that when we are making these kinds of promises as governing parties during an election campaign, I really want to stress that we do need climate accountability, because we've only had targets pledged. We've never had any action on targets, whether it's been Liberals or Conservatives. So the creation and the funding of a climate accountability office is something that the NDP is really pushing forward. That provides that independent oversight for federal climate progress. And it doesn't just provide that for Parliament, it provides it for the public.
Okay, Eric, we do have a climate question coming up, but if it's not climate related, your response, then you can go ahead.
Yeah, just wanted to say on the point of accountability, our government brought forward a net zero accountability act, which is going to hold all future governments accountable to the net zero emission targets that we set. So I wholeheartedly agree. Making investments to fight climate change is important, but policies that also hold governments and hold politicians and elected leaders accountable is critical. And that's why we passed the Net Zero Accountability Act, for that very purpose.
Well, that will lead very nicely into our next question. So thanks for the tee up. The next subject is climate action. Both of your parties have been clear in their platforms that addressing climate change, including reducing emissions to slow the rate of the Earth's warming in line with the reporting and recommendations of the IPCC, is a priority. Reaching net zero emissions and leading globally on climate forums make up part of both of your parties' platforms. The data tells us that municipalities emit or regulate 60% or more of emissions, with a huge chunk of this being from transportation. Many municipalities, including the City of Windsor, have declared climate emergencies, passed climate plans and emissions reduction targets of their own, and increasingly use a climate lens or analysis on their own decision-making in all spheres of their responsibility. An example of this is the City of London, which just a week ago canceled a road expansion project due to the assessed climate impacts. Yet despite strong language on the need for ambitious climate action, neither of your party's platforms embeds climate considerations consistently across the platform ideas related to municipalities. And housing is one example. If elected, how will your party use the various tools available to the federal government to adequately support municipalities to embed climate priorities in all of their decision-making? Eric, you have the first shot at this one.
Well, thanks, Rich. And again, just to emphasize, our party recognizes that really climate change is an existential threat to our communities. And all you have to do is look back to the flooding catastrophes that we experienced in 2016 and 2017 in our community to know how absolutely serious it is. Our government has the strongest track record of making investments to fight climate change. That's over $100 billion to fight and address climate change, and also to support our green recovery. We set ambitious targets, 40% emission reductions by 2030. We're the first government to put a price on pollution as well too, to make it no longer free for industry, for example, to pollute. But we're working with municipalities and provinces because we know that it is an all hands on deck approach. We know all levels of government have to have a hand in addressing climate change. And that's why we're making record investment, for example, in public transit to help communities like ours modernize our aging, long past its due expiry date bus fleet, and making sure that we're also making permanent the public transit fund starting in 2026. These are just some of the examples of how we are working hand in hand with municipalities. We've also launched a $400 million active transportation fund. And so that's something that I'll be working very closely both with Mayor McNamara and with Mayor Dilkins, so that our community goes after that 400 million active transportation fund. But it really has to be an all hands on deck approach. And the other thing I mentioned is obviously the Net Zero Accountability Act, which holds the federal government to account to make sure that it meets its emissions targets. And I believe that setting an example federally is also going to have an impact and hopefully inspire local municipal actors to follow suit as well.
Thank you, Eric. Cheryl, you have 1 minute to respond.
Yeah, I think C12 and the federal action that's top down, this is a historic opportunity that we're talking about here, about incentivizing and facilitating municipalities to be able to have projects that actually work towards net zero in a partnership. That's why we talk about national strategies. I have to say that that is embedded in all of our platform. I would have to say that an environmental lens and a disability lens are something that are used in the NDP platform right now. And innovations that we can get started on right away are actually exciting and things that are hopeful and provide best practices for municipalities. So for instance, where Greyhound Bus has eliminated their intercity services, that's something that we could be putting forward and establishing with buses that are not just locally procured, but are going towards that zero emission strategy with those kinds of buses. Yeah.
Thank you. Eric, you'd like to rebut?
Yeah, just another perfect example of how we can help work with municipalities. When we announced last month $100 million record investment in affordable housing in Windsor, Essex, to basically repair and renew our existing affordable housing stock, one of the elements or criteria to receive that funding is to make sure that the improvements or renovations make the houses resilient and sustainable as well too, and energy efficient. And so when the federal government puts forward a funding envelope like that, like the Repair and Renewal Fund, again, historic funding for affordable housing, it could also include, again, basically these stipulations that the funding is there for energy efficient retrofits. And that's what we've done.
Cheryl, do you care to respond to that?
Yeah. Well, I'm just going to say that projects that were already online and funding them are not the same as new builds and having stipulations put in place for federal dollars. Every federal dollar has to have a stipulation attached to it, an incentive to be addressing climate and the ways that it can be accessed. Like I mentioned earlier about living roofs. Here in Windsor, the issue of flooding is top of mind for us. And, you know, stormwater release, the slow release of stormwater after an extreme weather event means that you need stormwater bunkers underground. You have to incentivize those kinds of projects and let it be the call of the municipalities and their urban planning for implementing these kinds of things. And it has to be stable, consistent funding. You can't just have one-off grants every once in a while if you want to have meaningful progress.
Okay, you guys have spoken a lot about housing already, and that is the subject of our next topic. So housing, a crisis of affordable housing has hit the city of Windsor and the county of Essex, like other communities across the country. In this region, average incomes have remained steady, while the cost of housing has risen sharply in the past year. Both of your parties have released detailed platforms on housing that focuses largely on increasing supply and or placing money in the hands of purchasers. But there is little in either platform about housing innovation, nor on exactly how your government would work directly with municipalities to get the right kinds of housing built quickly. So the question is actually two parts. How can Windsorites and Essex County residents be confident that your party, if elected, will be able to deliver on building the millions of housing units that are needed across the country in an efficient and sustainable way? And part two, what policy changes can you highlight to ensure that both private and public investments in housing remain affordable? And Cheryl, you are on the clock.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's why we like to use the term a variety of housing options, so that you have all of these different mixes of construction that's going on. We have to incentivize building the housing that developers are not tending to build right now because they want to see a certain profit margin, and there's a market for it. So what we have to do is make sure that we're going back to investing in the kind of affordable housing like was done after World War II. That is sustained, that has kept people even aging in place to this day as I'm knocking on doors. I think that one of the things that would help in communities is something that we're proposing for allowing for, I will call them navigators, and helping to get access to housing funding, to dedicated fast start funds that can streamline an application process, and to actually create specific components for projects that you can say, okay, I am going to implement these elements, like these 9 options, I'm going to implement 6 of them so I can access this kind of funding from the federal government. And to do it in such a way like we use the federal gas tax model. That is a prescribed allocation formula that allows for that stable and consistent funding and isn't just a whim of a government at one time. Because it is long-term planning. There's a lot of work that has to go into this. I even think about when we talk about aging in place and elder care and long-term care facilities that can be built and be culturally appropriate. We have a lot of Indigenous people here that are expressing interest for those kinds of things to be built. It can be done. We have land that has been bought with the public purse. We need to find ways to partner and use that property and repurpose things, like, for instance, Gordon McGregor School.
Okay, Eric, you have 1 minute to respond.
Yeah, Rich, I mean, I wish I had more than 1 minute to talk about this issue. It's so absolutely critical. You know, the previous conservative government didn't feel the federal level had any role to play in housing. And when we arrived in 2015, we immediately committed $70 billion to the National Housing Strategy to build additional supply. We knew how absolutely critical affordable housing was. But in addition to that as well, too, you talked about innovation. You know, we launched an affordable housing challenge that basically, invited community organizations, not-for-profits, business owners, industry to come up with innovative solutions to our housing crisis here. And even locally, we had a local organization that received funding to do some really innovative research and work on secondary units. But, you know, a critical piece of affordable housing is going to be the partnership with the private sector. And I'm happy to say that a month ago, we had the first and largest federal affordable housing partnership with Peter Valente, a local developer, to build additional affordable housing units in our community. And so you're absolutely right. Building supply, protecting home buyers, working with the private sector and not-for-profit sector to build additional homes and to create innovation. It has to be an all hands on deck approach. This is too important of an issue and too important of a priority in our community.
Cheryl, you'd like to have another crack here.
Yeah, that's why it's such a frustrating issue for people, because we've been talking about this. We have been warned about this issue for, I want to say, the last 15 years anyway, heavily, and there has been inaction. There has been missed opportunities. Even when I was in government, the Liberals held the majority. They could have addressed the foreign buyers tax that we're proposing now, for a 20% foreign buyers tax. That speculation has really hurt the market in terms of how people are able to access these starter homes. That market is just not available there for them. So we have to find ways to incentivize it. But that action just has not been there when simply it could have been done. In the 30-year mortgage, bringing that back, that's been being asked for the last 10 years.
Yeah,
Eric, you'd like to jump back in.
I just wanted to add on that in terms of action. You know, a month ago, we announced again $100 million record investment in Windsor-Essex for affordable housing to repair and renew existing stock, but also $10 million for new affordable housing. And at the same time, a week later, we announced a partnership, a $27 million partnership with Peter Valente, a private developer, Again, the first and largest federal-private partnership in our community. Those are concrete steps forward. It's concrete action. More work absolutely needs to be done. And that's why I'm looking forward to working with both Gary McNamara and Mayor Dilkins to bring that really needed affordable housing investment that is there, but to bring it here to Windsor, Essex. It's a priority.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we move on to our fourth and final prepared question, I just want to remind the audience that the Q&A function is open. And if you have a question that you'd like to ask of the candidates, now would be a good time to put it in the queue because we are coming to the last prepared question. And the subject of that will be equity and vulnerability. The pandemic has highlighted loud and clear the inequities of our Canadian cities. In Windsor, Essex, like in other parts of our country, COVID-19 has hit some communities, in particular Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, harder than others. Many municipal services, which are disproportionately relied upon by members of traditionally marginalized communities, were cut during the pandemic. Several recent tragic events have highlighted again that our cities, even our sidewalks, are not safe for all members of society. Crises in mental health and addictions too have skyrocketed here as elsewhere. Much of this falls at the feet of cash-strapped municipalities to address while remaining reliant on higher levels of government for support. Something that both of you as former councillors know very well. What is the single most important idea that you and your party can deliver, if elected, that will make our cities and communities more equitable for our most vulnerable residents as we emerge from this pandemic? And Eric, you go first.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. Again, I wish I had 10 minutes or half an hour to talk about this incredibly important issue. You're right, COVID really had disproportionate impact on certain segments of the population. I'm thinking about women, I'm thinking about youth, racialized communities, and others. And so what we can't afford in this community is to have a two-speed recovery and a two-tier Canada. It simply cannot happen. And first and foremost, it's why we're committed to supporting and strengthening a universal healthcare system, accessible healthcare system in Canada. That is our pledge. That's always been our commitment. But in terms of what is I think one of the single most important commitments that our government is making is really to the disability community. And, we introduced the Accessible Canada Act 2 years ago, which is committed to building a barrier-free Canada, but at the same time, something that we just passed is the Disability, Inclusion Action Plan and the Canada Disability Benefit, which will be transformative for Canadians with disabilities, because it's going to provide them with the support that they need, the financial support that they need. So many of Canadians with disabilities are living in poverty disproportionately in our community. And that gap was absolutely exacerbated during COVID. And so making those investments to create a true barrier-free Canada, but also making sure that we are financially supporting Canadians with disabilities so that they can live a life of quality and increase their quality of life is absolutely critical. So I think our work, our historic work on the Disability Inclusion Action Plan is something that's going to have a tremendous impact across our country.
Thank you, Eric. And Cheryl, you have a minute to respond.
I have to wholeheartedly disagree with that illusion that people with disabilities have been supported. A very small portion of people were able to get the disability tax credit accessed and mean tested economic support that was needed during the pandemic. It would have been very easy. The reports, this has been studied to death. This is something that could have been done right away. First, second, third wave, there were all kinds of opportunities to really help people with disabilities. We are not meeting the United Nations Declaration on the rights of people with disabilities. The language that we're using in the Accessible Canada Act is not consistent. It's not enforceable. The measures do not match, and we have to do a much better job. And we missed opportunities. And at every turn during this pandemic, there are people with disabilities who have been left in poverty, totally ignored, and not able to access any other supports. Not only that, but the mental health issues that have come with that have created more problems for homelessness. And when you hear the stories from people and find out that there are systemic issues that could have been addressed and should have been addressed without even needing debate in Parliament, some of this needed simple language tweaks within parliamentary and bureaucratic settings. It just took that political astuteness, and I'm really disappointed that it's being portrayed that there is this help there. We have a national building code that does not meet the human rights law, and that needs to be renewed every 5 years by the end of December. It is not even put into the equation by the Liberals. They've totally ignored. There's such a disconnect. It's very frustrating.
Okay, Cheryl, you went a little bit over time there. So Eric, I'm going to give you a chance to respond, and then we'll leave it at that.
Yeah, 100%. And what I wanted to say is, again, our Liberal government passed the landmark Accessible Canada Act, which is creating a barrier-free Canada. And at the same time, we also established the first minister for persons with disabilities. And the third point I would argue is that we've introduced and tabled the Disability Inclusion Action Plan, which is a holistic approach to support Canadians with disabilities, both in terms of financially, but also in terms of allowing them to connect to the labor market, and at the same time, remove barriers in the community to accessibility, physical barriers as well. And so, yes, we've identified those issues. We believe it's an absolute priority, and we are working to address those issues with concrete investments and concrete actions.
Cheryl, you have 15 seconds if you'd like to say something.
Have you read the Disability Inclusion Action Plan survey? It's so out of touch with what is reality for people with disabilities. Disability advocates and their allies have been talking about this is just another gesture. It's gesture politics. You could start right away with the Senate report that says that you need to make the disability tax credit refundable and make it accessible for everyone.
Eric, is it gesture politics?
The Canada Disability benefit is going to be transformative for Canadians with disabilities to finally provide them with the support that they need.
Already.
So many Canadians with disabilities live in poverty. This is a transformational initiative that will lift hundreds of thousands of Canadians with disabilities out of poverty and provide the quality of life that they deserve. This is a transformational policy.
Okay, I'm going to end the conversation there just because we have a lot of other subjects we need to get to. And now would be the time to get to our audience interaction. And so we have a good question first, and something that both of you have seen firsthand as councillors, as we alluded to earlier, and as MPs. So can both candidates kindly let us know how much money they were able to attract to our region as an MP to address the specific issue of flooding? Cheryl, you have the first go, and in this round is 1 minute each. Go ahead, Cheryl.
Well, off the top of my head, I remember the round one funding for the St. Paul pump station for the city of Windsor was an application project that I worked really hard to see follow through, and that was, I believe, 32 million, and they were told to go ahead for round 2 and round 3. And at that time, it was a different MP. Now, what happens is there's expertise in program funding means that you have to use your engineers, your expertise to get projects shovel ready, so to speak. They have to be ready, and you have to help facilitate these applications so that they meet the projects. They're not designed to be refuse. They want to be, you want to see them succeed, right? So I would like to see that continue in the city of, in the town of Tecumseh. Those applications are still being prepared. In order to get funding, you have to apply for it. And when you apply for it, that is up to the MP to follow through and make sure that you get the funding.
Okay, Eric.
Yeah, Rich, so over the last 18 months, we've brought $450 million in investment to our region for various projects and initiatives. It's a record amount. And also within the last 2 years, there's been $57 million specifically allocated to Windsor and Essex County for flood mitigation. So the city of Windsor received about $33 million in the first round of something called the Disaster Mitigation Adaptation funding. In the last 18 months, since I've become an MP, in addition, we've also brought an additional $25 million to this region as well, too, including a record investment for the town of Tecumseh, specifically for flood mitigation of about $11 million, which is the single largest federal investment in the town of Tecumseh. I'm happy to report as well, too, something I was advocating for with Minister of finance is for additional funding to be included for the disaster mitigation and adaptation funding. And in this last budget, we've actually topped up the DMAF funding by an additional $1.2 billion. And so that's funding that I'll be working with Mayor Dilkens and Mayor McNamara on to attract to this community. But in total, we've received $57 million in our region specifically for disaster mitigation and adaptation funding for flooding.
Thank you, Eric. Cheryl, you'd like to respond?
Yeah, if we're talking about program funding that we're counting as like for ourselves and rolling total, I mean, I can do the same thing too. Public transit infrastructure, $66 million, flood prevention, the 32 million at St. Paul's Pump Station, affordable housing and homelessness, 22 million, innovation, 2 million, New Horizons for seniors, 69, 694,000. Like we all can keep tallies like that. The problem that we have in every municipality is that there is this illusion that you have to wait for a grant or some opportunity, have to strike while this iron is hot, and you cannot do long-term planning. Some of these applications that Eric has been talking about that came up, like it takes years to get the professional expertise, and your taxpayer dollars are paying for those preparations too. We need to make sure that we have stable and consistent relationships with municipalities, whether it's with the town of Tecumseh or with the city of Windsor, not just with our mayors, but with their engineers and with urban planning, to be able to make sure that we have long-term planning strategies. National strategies are key to all of this. It cannot be piecemeal.
Eric, you want to respond?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Rich, you know, having a direct voice in Ottawa and having a seat at the table makes all the difference in the world. I'll give you an example. Yesterday, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland was in town, and we had a roundtable both with our labor leaders, but also with community organizations and leaders to talk about supports for workers and working families. The ability of our decision makers in Ottawa to hear directly from local leaders and local constituents is absolutely a difference maker. It's absolutely critical. And over the last 18 months, we've held over 100 such meetings between cabinet ministers and local community leaders and constituents, so that they hear, the decision makers in Ottawa hear directly, not just from me, but hear directly from our constituents on the ground in terms of what are the local priorities. That's important.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on to the next audience question. And this one comes from Philippa von Ziegenweit. Mayor Dilkens has been pushing for increased federal funding so our new hospital can be built. However, the chosen greenfield location is contradicted by both parties' climate promises. How do the candidates feel the plans for the new hospital need to be improved to keep the region on track with our local goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2041 and ultimately net zero by 2050? And Eric, you have the first go with this one.
Yeah, I supported the new hospital when I was 6 years on city council, advocated for it. And as a member of parliament, I support it to this very day. I think it's absolutely critical for our community, for us to modernize our healthcare. We absolutely need it. I think COVID has absolutely demonstrated how tremendous that need is in our community to have modern healthcare and modern infrastructure, healthcare infrastructure. I've supported it as a city councillor. I support it as a member of parliament. I do believe that with a strong federal liberal government, that there will be funding available to make sure that the building is as green as possibly, as sustainable and resilient as it possibly can be. I do believe that we can make additional investments to deal with issues of accessibility and transportation to and from the hospital. And I do believe that that hospital, the location, is located in an area where, when we're seeing the growth projections for Windsor-Essex, that hospital will very shortly be in the middle of a community. And so you have to build basically where the puck is going, or where the trends are moving to. But I supported the regional hospital as a city councillor all 6 years, and I continue to support it as a member of parliament. I think it's absolutely critical and a top priority for our community.
Okay, Cheryl, your response.
Yeah, the glaring omission is the commitment to the funding, the Canada Health Act and the federal role. Utter failure and inaction by Conservatives and Liberals that promised that they would restore the funding. We're down to like 23% funding from the federal government. It was designed for us to be at 50%. We need to bring that back up immediately. We need to make sure that that funding is also including pharmacare and dental care so that we're actually making savings. And when it comes to actual building structures, we have to make sure that we're incentivizing the kind of innovations that we're talking about. And no matter where a hospital is located, you've got to have that public infrastructure so that people can get there. And that is not just on the backs of property taxpayers in a community. That is federal. That is a federal responsibility to do that. So all of those calculations have to be made, and the federal government has to step up and say that they are going to be part of a responsible public transit to and from a hospital, and to make sure that you actually have the responses for ambulance, the stations that they're going to need to reconfigure. Anytime that we're looking at these things, you mentioned earlier about being holistic, Eric, there's no way you can be holistic if you are stopping short of funding so crucially that you're actually crippling a healthcare system and you're setting it up to fail.
Okay, Eric, your response.
Yeah, I'm just going to say, unlike my counterpart here, I want to state unequivocally that I support an acute care regional hospital, and we need to move quickly to get that hospital built. And I think it's absolutely a top priority. And I believe that as a member of Parliament, I think it's absolutely critical to state unequivocally that we support an acute care regional hospital in our community. It's simply too important and an absolute top priority.
Cheryl, I guess to you, do you support the acute care hospital?
Yeah, I actually find that a very dangerous distraction, because we know how jurisdictions work. If you've been a municipal councillor and you know how the jurisdictions work, whenever we talk about ideas in federal leadership, that's something the Liberals love to throw back at the NDP. We're talking about funding this hospital properly. We're talking about funding healthcare properly. And it is not being done. It's a promise that has been broken by Liberals time after time. And the promise isn't even in there this time in the platform. You have to fund healthcare properly. And that means the infrastructure and a new hospital. I believe that we deserve a new hospital too. I also know that there are places where hospitals are closing and it's going down where ministers live. I mean, so the idea that you have to have this special person, I reject that premise that you have to have that. What you have to have is a commitment to proper funding and working in partnership with the different jurisdictions, and then linking your strategies, using your environmental lens, as the original question was about innovating and making sure that you have something that is answer to a climate crisis. So that's just a total distraction. And I'm really disappointed that we're going down that road when we all should be talking about what we're going to do to expand healthcare.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next subject here, and it is about zoning. What tools does the federal government have to incentivize municipalities to make changes to zoning laws in order to increase housing density supply in existing neighborhoods that are currently only zoned for low density housing? Cheryl, you have the floor.
Can you hear me? Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so yes, this is a great opportunity for us to talk about how you look at different neighborhoods and how we tap into those municipal plans that have the ability to look at different neighborhoods, because it's not just about infilling with not just high density infilling in neighborhoods. We've also got to look at some of the other trends that are happening that impact these neighborhoods as well. You probably have heard terms like, we say, food deserts. There are neighborhoods that are only served by a private ATM machine in a corner store. We have to look at walkability and neighborhoods where all of these services can be put in there. When municipalities identify what they can do in different neighborhoods, and then the federal government supports that with incentives, for small businesses that recognize, you know what, there is no local grocer in this neighborhood. Can we help a municipality and support that so that they can have that flexible zoning to have these 15-minute neighborhoods and where you can walk 5 minutes to get groceries. That's the other part of brownfield development and repurposing buildings, like I said, that are in the public purse. We have schools that are actually in residential neighborhoods that are key to this, but we have to make sure that we are partnering with municipalities so that they can actually do what is best suited in their neighborhoods.
Okay, Eric, you have a bit of extra time to respond to this one.
Sure. I just wanted to say that, zoning issues traditionally are the purview of municipalities and provincial governments. But I think where the federal government can play an important role, for example, again, going back to the national housing strategy, the $70 billion we've put forward to build additional supply. And that includes programs like the Rapid Housing Initiative that works directly with municipalities to provide funding for quick, accelerated, affordable housing construction, but at the same time working through, for example, through the co-investment fund with private developers as well too, provides those incentives to build affordable housing, build apartment buildings, get that density built in the hearts of communities like ours, where it's strongly needed. But at the same time, and I agree with Cheryl, that having a strong federal liberal government also provides additional funding for example, active transportation, which diversifies transportation options. Not everybody owns a car. And so having, for example, good bike trails, having multi-use trails, having excellent, strong public transit. Again, we're making historic investment both in active transportation and public transit is absolutely critical to attract that density, for example, inside core communities, inside downtown cores, for example, because again, folks need to be able to get to their doctors, their healthcare appointments. They need to get to work. They need to get to school. And so making those public transit and active transportation options available is one of the most critical aspects that a federal government can do to attract housing and attract folks into specific areas and increase housing density.
Thank you, Eric. Cheryl, you can have a quick response here, but I have a few more questions that I'd really like to get to. So let's please keep it tight.
Yeah. Well, I just want to reiterate again how important it is to make sure that you have prescribed allocated funding that is stable and predictable for municipalities and that you are facilitating with a national strategy. These grants that never get spent fully, and we're talking about national now at the federal level. Some of this is a drop in the bucket. You actually have to leverage with those municipalities. So I will just stress how important that is to get away from this idea of a grant and go to a stable and consistent funding model, much like the success of the federal gas tax. That's a best practice that we see can work.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question here, and this one comes from Fraser Fathers. We've seen over the last several years that income remained relatively flat while the price of goods has risen. Within this environment, as mentioned earlier, Windsor is going through an economic transition that risks leaving more people behind. We have lower educational attainment than provincial averages, higher rates of NEET youth, employment sectors that have struggled to effectively transition in other communities. How will the federal government assist in managing this transition for individuals and families locally, rather than championing new jobs created that may be displacing a person from Windsor, Essex? And this question will go to Eric first.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. Absolutely critical question. And whenever we talk about federal municipal relationships, we often talk about physical infrastructure, but something that we have to focus on is human infrastructure, making investments in people. And absolutely, we've seen during COVID the danger of having, a two-speed recovery in Canada and a two-speed economy. So a couple things right off the bat. Our federal government is making the largest federal investment in Canada's history in skills training, which is absolutely critical to make sure that folks are upskilled so that they can compete and have those good paying jobs and be able to build prosperity for their families. But one policy in particular, I think, is going to be absolutely transformational for our region, and that's $10 a day childcare. We have one of the highest child poverty rates in our community. And so $10 a day childcare is not only going to allow young people in our community to get the best start in life that they possibly can have, but it's going to also free up moms and dads to be able to either go to school to get the training that they require, or go to work and get a good paying job that's going to provide for their families. You know, childcare, it's for so many families, it's like a mortgage, payment. It's an absolutely huge burden. This is going to unleash and unlock a lot of energy and a lot of potential in our community, and really support a lot of families, a lot of moms and dads. I think that is the most impactful single policy in the last 50 years for our community and Windsor-Tecumseh and Windsor in general.
Thank you, Eric. Cheryl, your response.
Yeah, I wish the Liberals had felt so strongly about that years ago, because this was being talked about and was promised and never implemented. And at the national level, we know that a $10 a day daycare is about quality, new spaces also being added, and making sure that these are jobs that people have very fulfilling careers in early childhood education, and that it also taps into this whole issue of early intervention. The earlier the intervention, the more successful the outcome for children, which brings us back to healthcare, and how that has to be supported properly. It's inadequate right now. It's very hard for families that are seeking supports when they do recognize that they have needs, whether it's mental health, whether it is affording their medication, whether it is dental. These are things that have to be put into our healthcare system as soon as possible. Right now, we have to bring those funding levels up. I think once you get that healthcare system inclusive, you have a peace of mind for people, that they can actually not have to worry about how they're going to buy nutritional food for their families and then pay for medication. It just doesn't make sense to me with the stress that families have, that this is not something that we have acted on years ago. And I'm very, very frustrated that this is something that is still only election-oriented promises and no action once the Liberals actually see fruition.
I see Eric shaking his head.
Yeah, actually, Rich, we've signed agreements on childcare with 8 provinces. We're still waiting for Doug Ford in Ontario to come on board. We feel this is a transformational policy for our community, $10 a day childcare. But in addition to that, to answer your original question, largest investment in skills training, and also largest investment in our young people to make post-secondary education more affordable by, for example, eliminating interest on student loans, doubling Canada's student loan grants, and also changing the repayment program so that Canadians who are have post-secondary loans don't have to make any repayment until they're earning at least $50,000 per year. All of those things taken together is an investment in human infrastructure in our community. And it is absolutely critical that we have a strong federal Liberal government that continues to make those investments, because it is critical in our community. When we talk about federal municipal relationships, we have to talk about physical infrastructure, but above all, we have to also talk about investments in human infrastructure, in people.
Okay, Cheryl, do you want to respond to that?
I just want to reemphasize, we're talking new spaces as well. You have to increase, you have to expand it. It's not just $10 a day daycare. It's about expanding it. It's about making it properly accessible for all these Canadians that need it.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more audience question, and then we'll move to our closing statements. So this question comes from John R. Mayer, and he asks, have any of the political parties and candidates considered or made proposals for a fast track strategy that could make crisis emergencies so more timely action can be taken? For example, affordable housing is now in a crisis, but it will take another several years to implement a promised campaign promise. In almost every area of contemporary life, short-term solutions are needed. That is a call for more immediate action to alleviate suffering. Does your party have a plan? And we will start with Cheryl.
Yeah, we recognize that years of inaction by Conservatives and Liberals, years of eroding supplies, years of increasing gaps in our safety net have created crisis. So you do have to have all hands on deck and treat it as a crisis, which is an unfortunate reality, but you have to do that. And at the same time, this is why we talk about national strategies. We have to be able to be proactive, not just reactive. You have to be able to have a government that can be resilient and responsive in a crisis that you didn't see coming 20 years ago. And that is the huge problem that we have now. But yes, unfortunately, right now, we do have to treat these things in an immediacy. And that means increasing civil servants that can help navigate and quickly get these projects off the ground and create these partnerships. It's not something that can just be done every election cycle, unfortunately, to have promises and then have them not acted on. We need national strategies that are embedded for each region, each province, each municipality to be able to link into.
Eric, your response.
Yeah, I really like John's question. And I think that a strong federal government has to do two things at once. I think they have to be nimble and responsive. And at the same time, they have to do the long-term planning as well, too. I think that's absolutely critical. So I don't think it's an either or proposition. I think a strong government needs to do both. I'm proud of the fact of how quickly our government responded to COVID and this historical pandemic. You know, 9 out of $10 that came for battling COVID came from the federal government to tackle it, whether it's vaccinations, whether it's contact tracing, rapid testing, whether it's the Safe Restart Agreement to support our municipalities and school boards. We responded very quickly, getting historical funding out the door to support Canadians and working families and workers and businesses. And so our government responded very quickly, showed how nimble we could be. But I agree with John. We also need we also need stable, predictable funding and strategies. And that's why we have a national housing strategy, for example, that is not just a single year commitment, but it's a 10-year commitment, $70 billion commitment to build 1.4 million additional homes. And so I think you have to have a government that does both, that can be nimble and respond to crises when they do happen. And I believe we've done that better than most governments in the world when it comes to COVID. But at the same time, you have things like the National Housing Strategy, which are long-term, predictable funding plans where the government says we're going to be here for a really long time, making those investments that municipalities and communities depend on.
Cheryl, you had your hand up earlier.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank goodness we had the NDP there to push the Liberals to do that. And just listening to Eric's answer, now you can see why I'm so frustrated about people living with disabilities getting no support. Look how nimble they can be when there is political will. And these same people needed those supports rolled out just as much as everybody else. And in fact, they're still waiting. Every single day is a new choice to ignore them.
Go ahead, Eric.
Rich, I just wanted to ask, in my role as a parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion, it was our shop that designed and rolled out a lot of the programming that came out during COVID, whether it was the Canada Emergency Student Benefit, the CERB, the CRB, the one-time disability payment. It came from our shop. I don't recall the NDP being there in those discussions when we were designing and rolling out those programs, but I can tell you who was. Canadians. We absolutely consulted with Canadians here locally in Windsor-Tecumseh and across Canada for every single one of those programs. We listened to Canadians, what Canadians needed. They were the ones that were driving this process and telling us what supports they need, and we responded. And that's how that process worked.
Okay, Cheryl, a brief wrap up on that.
The process actually works with senior bureaucrats rolling all this out. It was the civil service after the political will and the theater in the House of Commons. This is where the real work gets done. And to try and take credit for that and say that we were not at the table is actually very disingenuous, because a lot of work does get done. And when you choose to make it political, this is what happens. Now you have no answer for why people living with disabilities did not get support like CERB.
You're absolutely incorrect on that, Cheryl. We did provide not only one-time disability payments, but for example, the Canada Emergency Student Benefit, we absolutely put a disability lens on every single program that we rolled out to make sure that Canadians with disabilities had the supports that they needed.
No, they don't have the support they need, Eric.
Cheryl, I was there. I was there.
They
We
did-
worked together
No,
with
you're
Minister
not there
Qualtrough
now.
to develop those programs that served
I was there
millions of
too.
Canadians and got them through
No.
this crisis.
No,
We were
Okay.
there.
absolutely not.
I'm going to jump in. We're going to have to agree to disagree on this one because I want to give you both time to get to your closing arguments. Quickly before we do that, I just want to apologize to Christine, who put a question into the chat forum, and we just do not have time to get to it, but I'm happy that we did talk about transit in a number of ways. And also John's question came to us via email, so that's why you did not see it in the Q&A form. Okay, moving to closing statements. Eric, you have the floor and you have 2 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, Rich, and I'd like to thank everyone who asked those excellent questions today, and thank you so much to the Windsor Law Center for Cities for organizing this important discussion about vision for cities. Some of you may know I was a city councillor for 6 years, and my formative experience came in 2016, which was the first of 2 catastrophic 1 in 100 year flooding events that left thousands of residents face to face with the ravages of climate change. And I remember standing with a resident on the steps of his basement, which was under 4 feet of water. Those floods caused over $300 million of insurable damages and left many scars in our community. And I ran for member of parliament because I saw firsthand that our community needs a strong federal partner in Ottawa and a seat at the table in order to meet the challenges and the opportunities that we face in Windsor-Tecumseh. And in the last 18 months as a Liberal member of parliament, we delivered $450 million in federal investments that includes record investment in flood mitigation, public transit, affordable housing, active transportation, high-speed broadband, all the things that make cities resilient, livable, and connected. We also organized over 100 meetings between cabinet ministers and local leaders and constituents. And it is that direct contact with decision makers in Ottawa is how we were able to save the airport towers, advance Ojibwe National Urban Park, and pass single sports betting. Moving forward, I believe only a strong progressive Liberal government can address the gaps and weaknesses that COVID has exposed. And at the top of that list is strengthening healthcare and fixing long-term care, making sure every Canadian has a safe and affordable place to call home. And at the same time, our government's bold leadership on climate change has presented a once-in-a-generation opportunity to grow thousands of green manufacturing jobs by bringing electric vehicle manufacturing here to Windsor-Tecumseh. And finally, creating $10 a day childcare will be transformative for our community, helping to strengthen middle-class families and lift many out of poverty. Investing in healthcare, building affordable housing, fighting climate change, growing green manufacturing jobs, creating universal affordable childcare, that is what is on the line this election. And on September 20th, elect a strong, progressive, Liberal government. I'm Eric Kazmierczak, and I ask for your vote. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Cheryl, you have 2 minutes. Go ahead.
Well, government is about choices. You're choosing to buy a pipeline, choosing to buy new freezers for Loblaws, letting the ultra rich get a pass on paying their fair share. Or, we can choose to invest in people and ensure we're no longer creating systems with huge cracks for people to fall through. As we grapple with the fallout of COVID-19, too many Canadians are living on the edge, they're slipping deeper into poverty, and even when the economy recovers, it's clear that those who are struggling now will be at a disadvantage for a long time to come. We need big ideas to confront the challenges our country is facing, and we need the political courage to follow through. That's what the NDP has. The NDP has that political courage. We believe this is a critical moment to strengthen our social safety net and to improve income supports. Broken promises and past half measures have put us in crisis, and now we see where the corporate agendas have led us to. Rather than corporate agendas, we have to make sure that we are strengthening our partnerships, making sure we have national strategies so that we do have the long-term plans to keep us sound and so that we are responsive to crises as they come up. The climate inaction has been very frustrating to watch how Canada is now leading the G7 nations in the highest emissions of greenhouse gas. And it's because we have only had words and no action. That political courage is something that I will bring back to Ottawa. I will bring that voice here from Windsor and Tecumseh to Ottawa, not bring Ottawa's prescriptions here on the basis of whim. That is a very dangerous plan, and it is not sustainable for our natural environment and for people.
Okay, and I'm sorry, Eric, but there's no ability to respond in closing statements. That brings our forum for today to a close. I'd like to say a big thank you to our candidates, Eric Kuzmarczyk and Cheryl Hardcastle, for taking part in some very good back and forth today. I think it was quite fulsome. And also the Centre for Cities for hosting today's debate. I wish you the best in your future debates. I'm sure there'll be a few more, and along the rest of the campaign trail. And to the viewers, make sure you vote on September 20th. Thank you, everyone.